Hello everyone, this is Lala, and today I'm going to be talking about the Middle Eastern North African Houseguests in Big Brother USA history, as well as the South Asian Houseguests in Big Brother USA history. I'm combining them both because one, I combined them with other people from the Asian continent on the last video I did of this a few years ago, and two, quite frankly, there aren't enough of them for me to talk about each of them separately, so I'm just going to combine them here. So this will be a decent enough length. Okay, so to be fair, there are no North African house guests that have ever been on Big Brother USA, so I'm just going to refer to Middle Eastern people. I do find it interesting that Middle Eastern people are considered quote unquote people of color, despite them being legally white in the United States, which they asked for throughout the last century, and they had that granted. So they're technically white people. And if you look through genealogical study, and PCA plots and all that, you would see that they are more related to Europeans than anyone else, even compared to South Asians. So they're like first cousins to Europeans. But I'm guessing since Big Brother came into play right when 9/11 happened and a lot of stigma was given towards that group of people, they're considered people of color in Big Brother. And 9/11 also caused some stigma against South Asians, despite the fact that they are a completely separate group from Middle Eastern people. But of course, a lot of ignorant ass Americans didn't know that. So I wouldn't be shocked if I just repeated most of the same information that I put on my last video. I know there's one South Asian house guest, so I definitely do have to update it. So I might just repeat the same information from my last video pertaining most of these, or I might add some commentary from a 2024 perspective, but we'll see as we go along. Okay, so the first group of people that I'm going to be talking about are West Asians. I was going to use the term Middle Eastern, but one of them don't fit in that category, and I've been told that they find that term very offensive. So I'm going to go with the more politically correct Western Asian title. So there are only five of them, or at least five that are known, that fit into this category, and there's actually a lot more Western Asians that are cast in Big Brother Canada than Big Brother USA, which is a problem because Big Brother USA has 14 more seasons than Big Brother Canada, but it says a lot that BB Can has more Western Asian people. So, just from my recollection of the five that are here, I noticed that the lighter skinned ones are treated better than the ones that are darker skinned, and we'll see how that is the case as I go through each of them. So, the first person that I'm going to discuss is Kesar, who was on Big Brother 6, Big Brother 7, and Big Brother All Stars, and has never had a long run in any of the seasons. So he was immediately put on the outs in Big Brother 6 and was seen as untrustworthy. He was put on the block week 1 and was never allowed to integrate into the house, though he didn't give anyone any reason to not be seen as untrustworthy. Since this was a few years after 9/11, there was a lot of awkward conversations that he had to have in the house, specifically about Islamophobia and the events that were taking place in Iraq. You would see this with some of his conversations with James and Eric. And then there was, of course, the argument that happened between himself and Yvette that took place in week 2, where it culminated with her calling him a sand NIGG bleep bleep. I believe you can fill out the rest. And that obviously pissed him off, and then he stood up against her, and then things escalated. And on the live feeds, she continued making racial slurs against him, his people, his religion, so on and so forth, throughout the entire season. But of course, we only got the one instance in the episodes. There really isn't anything to discuss pertaining his time in All Stars, but of course, a lot of the men didn't trust him, he was put on the outs, and he stood out a lot more compared to the majority white cast. There were even more awkward discussions about race in the second All Stars, since some didn't understand his perspective whatsoever, and he didn't completely understand the other people of color's perspectives and experiences as well. So there was a bit of that clash as well. Of course, people like Cody didn't trust him for some odd reason. And I remember Hamza from Big Brother Canada 6 commenting during the season that he felt like Kaysar was going through Islamophobia. For a very long time, he was the only Western Asian person to be on the show, and he clearly felt like he had to portray himself in a certain manner so he wouldn't embarrass his people due to the bad representation in media overall. So, 2024, Lala adding some commentary. And regarding the Yvette situation, I'm not going to say it is racism, as I do feel like it was more so xenophobia, as she was mainly attacking his Iraqi Muslim heritage. So it came more from xenophobia, and if you want to really be nitpicky, Hispanics as well as Middle Eastern North Africans were considered white, or at least census wise. So if two quote unquote white people are going at one another, is it really racism? That's something that could be debated. And also, I made a video about Kesar and Cody's interactions, and a lot of people accuse that as being racism, and I didn't see it as racism because Cody, a Sicilian man, has a lot of Levantine and Middle Eastern DNA within them, and that's mainly what Kesar has in him as well. And like I mentioned earlier, Middle Eastern and North Africans are considered white on the census when it came to the race theory and all that stuff, and even when you look at genealogy and stuff like that, they cluster with white Europeans. They are more related to Southern Europeans, so people like Cody and Southern Europeans are more related to Middle Easterners than anyone else, even other Europeans. And I think that dynamic maybe came from Cody being a newer player who didn't really watch much of the older seasons, Kaser being an older season player. So I think that's where their conflict came in. So apparently, with the quote unquote fame or notoriety that Kaser got from his first two seasons, but especially his first season, he said that it was a lot because people wanted to make him come off like some sort of Arab deity or a hero or an angel or like the beacon of the quote unquote good Arab Middle Eastern Iraqi representative, and he said that it overwhelmed him a lot to the point where he kind of like secluded himself. I'm assuming this must have been after Big Brother 7 and the notoriety of Big Brother became too much and it was also starting to wane. And he felt like it put a lot of pressure on him to be the perfect person. But at the same time, I do feel like he somewhat put himself in that position as well, based off of how he would kind of judge other people who acted a certain way. And he kind of like made himself the spokesperson for a lot of those issues and causes. And I found it interesting because in his third season, he stated that that was one of the reasons why he came back, because he saw all of this distress and conflict happening with all of these ethnic and racial groups in 2020, and he wanted to be that representation that he complained about in the May to late 2000s. But I'm assuming 14 years passed by, he became a husband and father, and he saw things differently in his early 40s than he did in his mid 20s. So I just found that to be interesting. And I note that he's the only one who got this hugely angelic edit out of all the people who fit in this group. So the next person we are going to discuss is Russell from Big Brother 11. So almost immediately, he was automatically deemed as untrustworthy by everyone in the house, even by the people in his alliance, before he even did anything. His alliance was willing to backdoor him in the second week, though at this point in the season, he was still very loyal to them. And of course, he had the clashes with Jeff, and everyone saw him as extremely aggressive due to his antics, which also didn't help because he was Middle Eastern as well, since most of the cast was aggressive, but it was made a huge deal with him specifically. Of course, on the show, we had that one argument between him and Chima where he was called a terrorist essentially, and of course, he calls out how bad she looks because you're accusing a Middle Eastern man of being a terrorist, especially with everything that has happened in that decade. And what's interesting, not in a good way, about this is that on the edit, production actually backed Chima up and tried to make it seem like it wasn't a racial slur. So they showed flashbacks of his arguments with several other people in the house. And then you have Natalie chiming in that it wasn't a racist microaggression. But on the feeds, several of the house guests continued to call him a terrorist and other racist slurs. So Russell was clearly right about this, but they just hid it from the show and made it seem like it was only about his personality. So Russell was definitely given an aggressive edit, which he definitely played into, and he is rarely mentioned by production or future house guests as a Middle Eastern, North African, or just a West Asian person or a representative. He was overall very negatively portrayed on the show, and I don't think he really cared about how he was portrayed and wanting to be seen as a good role model. But essentially, production used him to exhibit negative portrayals of West Asian people. And I think that's why they kind of put him under the bed compared to some of the others. So this is 2024 me, and I first have to say that he is Lebanese, so that is his ethnogenesis and his ethnic breakdown or ethnic makeup. I also think they had trouble with Russell because he was kind of hard to stereotype in comparison to Kesar. I don't know if Russell is Christian or Muslim. I don't even know if he's religious at all, so they didn't focus on that much. Where Kesar, they focused heavily on his religion. And I don't want to say Americanized is the word, but he wasn't easy to stereotype in a lot of the other ways. So that's why they didn't give him much focus. But they did stereotype him when it came to the aggressiveness. But outside of that, Russell was just not the typical person that you would see throughout the media when it comes to being Middle Eastern. In that regard, regarding the outfits, the accent, or whatever other traditions that some might assume with them, outside of the anger, which they definitely covered with him. So the next person I'm going to discuss is Victoria from Big Brother 16. And it's sad that after 22 years, she's still the only Western Asian woman to be on the show. Though in Big Brother Canada, they more often cast Western Asian women compared to West Asian men. In general, I don't really recall there being much discussion pertaining to her ethnicity, which is interesting for the reasons that I've stated earlier. There was the situation where Frankie threatened to R her, which he was talking about with some of the other house guests. But I think that might be the only thing that might have been attached to her ethnicity. But you also had women like Nicole and Christine who hated on the non white women on the season due to petty reasons, and Victoria was unfortunately a part of that list. So this is 2024 Lala, and I forgot to mention this in the last video, but her ethnicity is an Israeli. So she's from Israel, which is a part of the Levant and the Middle East. I really don't have much to say about her. So the fourth person in discussion is Paul. And he is the reason why I just didn't call this group Middle Eastern, outside of it being seen as offensive to some people. Because while he is from Armenia, the country technically isn't really seen as Middle Eastern, North African, or part of that group to many people. So I just went with Western Asian because it is a part of Western Asia. So, in general, there is no mention of his race or ethnicity in either of his two seasons, but I'm wondering if that's the case because he's a lot more white passing compared to all the others in this group. Okay, so this is 2024 Lala coming into the picture. And I was incorrect about this part where I mentioned that there's no mention of his ethnic makeup on his two seasons. I made the first video before I did my Big Brother series rewatch, and now that I've done my Big Brother series rewatch, I know for sure that this is incorrect. His ethnic makeup was mentioned a few times. Of course, he and his family mentioned primarily that he's Armenian, so that was the most consistent thing. And I know there's a lot of talk about how people of the Caucasus, so Armenians, Georgians, and some of the others, They don't like associating themselves with West Asia or the Middle East, and they tend to associate themselves with Europeans, though Armenia is in West Asia. I also remember there's some mention about him being Russian, like white European Russian, but after delving into it, there was some confusion there where his family might have been Armenians who lived in Russia, so they're ethnic Armenians who lived in Russia, so maybe that was the case. And there's a few comments from his family and maybe from himself as well that mention that he's also part Lebanese. So either way, that just makes him primarily West Asian. So that is why he is here. He was a part of the POC Newbie Alliance that was formed but blew up immediately. He was seen as aggressive and untrustworthy in Big Brother 18, especially in the mid portion of the season where he had that argument with Michelle, but nothing of the sort came up in Big Brother 19 at all. So the final person in discussion is Joseph from Big Brother 24. His ethnic makeup is half Syrian, I believe his mother is Syrian, and half Palestinian, with his father being Palestinian. Both of those are clearly from two different countries with their own histories, but they are both in the Levant, and the Levant is a part of West Asia or the Middle East. So, in general, he is a Levantine Middle Eastern man. So, that is his ethnic makeup. Now, I'm just going to go back towards my 2022 commentary. Before I even talk about his journey in the house, I have to talk about how they made him an alternate, despite the fact that he's from a severely underrepresented group. And what made it worse is that they made him an alternate to a black man. What this says to me is that production and casting clearly sees Houseguests under two categories: white and POC. So they're just having POCs be alternate for one another, even if they're not the same race. But they felt comfortable going into this season with having 5 white men and 3 black men to be the 8 that was in the season, after they already got flagged for having a lack of Asian representation last season, with that season supposing to be the start of the new POC implementation rule. Now, about his actual journey in the house, he was immediately put on the outs in the eyes of pretty much everyone in the house, and he was seen as untrustworthy, though it was partially due to him not wanting to talk game. And I didn't mention this in Kaysar's section, but like Kaysar, Joseph was either seen as useless or sexualized in the eyes of many men and women in the house. So there's that dichotomy as well. So even in the early weeks, he was always grouped in with the black people, mainly Monty and Taylor, whenever ethnicity came up. And you see this a lot in Big Brother seasons, where if POCs talk to one another, they are automatically assumed to be closer than they really are in reality, or are almost always seen as threatening. So a lot of POC don't even feel like they can talk to one another visibly. So now we have to get into the main event of Kyle essentially accusing all of the POCs of being in an alliance, though all the evidence suggested the contrary, with them setting one another home, them nominating one another, and he compared it to a cookout situation of the previous season, completely missing the point that the cookout was specifically about black representation, so grouping non-black people in that is problematic to say the least, and he doesn't even understand the nuances that different POC groups have their own journeys and their own experiences, as well as their own conflicts. This would be enabled by a lot of the white allies that Joseph was supposedly in an alliance with. They all kind of enabled this. He would be called, as well as the others, would be called bullies, scum, arrogant, aggressive, and that he, as well as others, would jump Kyle because they were arguing that he shouldn't use the veto. Joseph has talked about not wanting to see a Middle Eastern person, his words, be portrayed negatively, which was why he came onto the show, wanting to show his people in a positive light. So despite not even showing any of the adjectives that he was being described as, those negative adjectives and attributes were still thrown on him unjustly. And it continued even long after he was evicted. And what makes it even worse is that under all this racial stuff that was happening, he was the only one who was evicted due to it. And what makes it even worse is that production under edited him, they under edited all of his talk about representation, and they kind of gave Kyle this sympathy PR run because CBS saw that it was more important for Kyle to be redeemed than showing how the people of color were affected by this and even showed their journeys through it. They didn't show any of that type of talk. So even production didn't care to show his story about his purpose of being in the house, and his purpose of being in the house was used as a reason to evict him. So it just shows that even production has implicit biases, and there needs to be a lot of work done behind the scenes to improve actual representation. Several of the White House guests always get chance after chance after chance after chance to redeem themselves, but he never got that chance to redeem himself in the eyes of his fellow house guests, and that's just the typical journey of a person of color in the Big Brother house. Alrighty, so I have to talk about Hassam from Big Brother 25. The interesting thing, I literally recorded this entire video. I played back the entire video, and it wasn't until I got to the drag section where I realized, oh crap, I forgot someone. So this part where I'm discussing him is literally a very last minute addition to it. And Hassam is definitely an interesting person when it comes to this. One, he is Egyptian, that is his ethnic background, and I know Egypt is in North Africa, so Egypt, and he is North African as well, but I also noticed that Egypt is also considered a part of the Middle East, so I guess Egyptians are both Middle Eastern and North African. It's a very interesting dichotomy there. And one thing that I noticed about Hassam a lot is that he kept on mentioning that he's brown, he wants to form a brown alliance, and all of that stuff. He heavily identified with being brown. Though when you look at him, you tend to think that he is white, or you wouldn't immediately notice that he's just. You would think he's a European white person. But after listening to him and looking at him, I can definitely tell a bit more now that he is Egyptian, but he is definitely a lot more white presenting. And even though he grew up during a time where he would have been legally considered white, he doesn't see himself as that. And I remember on the feed, he talked about how he was treated very poorly during the 2000s, and that was when 9/11 happened. And I think based off his age, he would have been in his early to mid 20s. So he got a lot of vitriol to that. And I do think that experience and being a grown man while 9/11 was happening caused him to see things a lot more differently. At the same time, he definitely did fall into a lot of the tropes that people mentioned about Middle Eastern and North African people that I've noticed throughout the Big Brother overall. He was called aggressive by damn near everyone in the house. They were intimidated by him. Part of that was due to his comp ability, and I do think a part of that was also due to his size. But whenever he was firm in his decision or he was trying to strategize with people, they thought he was aggressive, they thought he was unlikable, and they kind of painted him as like the angry Arab man at some point, though we never saw him in any sort of confrontation or yell at anyone in general. I do think there's a few social cues that he didn't really understand, but he was definitely a fish out of water. And you could tell that he himself didn't feel comfortable with the cast since he would kind of isolate himself at various points in time. So despite him not lasting long, we definitely got a lot of insight in him. And he is the first and only North African person to be on Big Brother US, where there's been a few on Big Brother Canada. So that was interesting for me to point out. I also have to kind of mention that it seemed like he weaponized his identity at a few points, since he tried to form this brown alliance with Jake during his time in the house, and he kept on trying to form an Asian alliance with himself and Blue as well, despite Egypt being in Africa and not Asia. But that's kind of besides the point. But to other people, he was telling them that he was planning to send Jake home the very next week, and it was all just kind of a lie, so that kind of rubbed me the wrong way about him. And what also rubbed me the wrong way about him is that he literally heard Luke say the N word, and Corey was the one who called it out once they asked why Luke was pulled. And he mentioned who was in the room, and Hassam did not like that. And apparently, he got very mad at Corey about it, and that just kind of rubbed me the wrong way about him. And I thought that would be important enough to add in here. Now it is time to talk about the South Asian house guests, or the people who are of South Asian descent. I mentioned this in my first video, but the first person of South Asian descent was cast in the 20th season of the show, and I believe it was in like the 18th or 19th year of the show, which is just really, really, really bad. There's no reason why it should have taken them almost 2 decades to finally cast a South Asian person on the show. And what I noticed is that a decent amount of the South Asian people that were cast were mixed race. We have one that is mixed with white and the other that was mixed with black, and they didn't really portray the nuances of being a mixed race person on the show, which was just very disappointing in general. Though I definitely do think there were reasons for that we'll definitely get into once I get into those specific people. Obviously, I had to update this one because Jag was introduced after my first video, and obviously, not only did he win the season, but he talked about his heritage, his culture, his ethnicity in vast detail, so I clearly had a lot to cover, and I'm just going to get straight to it. So, our first South Asian house guest is Faisal from Big Brother 20. Like I said earlier, I can't believe it took 20 seasons and 18 years to get a South Asian house guest. So Faisal pretty much grew close to Swaggy almost immediately because they had a lot alike and the white male house guests didn't really care much for him, despite Faisal himself being half white. Of course, people didn't like that and they were seen as very intimidating together. But since Casey is also biracial with Asian and white, it is interesting to see how she was able to fit in with the White House guests more than Faisal did, though I'm wondering if gender played a part in that as well. For me coming in, I've noticed this whenever there are people who are mixed with either South Asian, Southeast Asian, or East Asian and white specifically, I do notice that there are times where their names can indicate their treatment. Casey, her first name and her last name are very white last names, as her last name is Park, while Faisal's name, his first name, and his last name, which is Shafat, indicates South Asian and Muslim descent, whereas Casey's name is more anglicized. Obviously, that's due to the racial makeup of their fathers. So I'm wondering if Faisal's name compared to Casey's name makes him stand out more and makes him more othered, despite being half white, but his name might suggest him leading more towards the non-white side. Or at least that's how some of the white people would automatically assume of him. Also, he is half Pakistani, and I remember a lot of the fans claiming that Pakistan was a part of the Middle East, where it never was a part of the Middle East, but it just kind of shows a lot of people's ignorance on the matter, since not only was Pakistan always in South Asia, it was literally a part of British India like 70 something years ago, and Pakistan itself was a very new country. Faisal is obviously a Muslim man and he practices his religion a lot, but you never saw him talk about it on the show. Though I remember he talked about it a lot on the feed, he talked about praying on the feed and all of that, and he talked a lot more about his Muslim faith and traditions on the challenge. So it's interesting to me that they let Kaysar talk about his religion and I don't want to say they shoved it in our faces, but they gave him a lot of content about that. But they didn't do that with Faisal, who is just as a Muslim. So I found that to be interesting. And another note that I have to add is Muslim isn't seen as a European or a white religion. So anyone who is Muslim tends to be othered. I'm going to refer to my old commentary now. So the main event that I specifically remembered is that Faisal and Haley were going through something pertaining to their showmance. Bailey and Roxanne were present, and then after they all just kind of like counted on him and he left, Bailey started making racist comments about him and other Muslim people because she didn't like something about his and Haley's showmance and insulted other Pakistani and Muslim women, as well as their men, pretty much claiming that the way they handle relationships is wrong, and it was just totally unnecessary. I also remember Angela running away from him as soon as she nominated him, and she wouldn't address him for days. Pretty much the same thing she did when she nominated Bailey, pulling out the "ooh, this scary POC" tactic BS that happens a lot in real life. So pretty much he was isolated in his final week, and he wouldn't leave the Have Not room for days up until his eviction. Everyone would consistently call him scary and intimidating, despite him not having a personality that fits like that. But due to his height, stature, and race, that came with the package. So, a season later, in Big Brother 21, they would cast Envy. And he is one of the three South Asians who aren't mixed, so that's interesting as well. So I pretty much remember a lot of the house isolating and making fun of him during his sole week in the game as a competitor, and they made a lot of stereotypical comments about him as well, despite him cooking for them, cleaning for them, and trying his very best to please these people, but they all just made fun of him. And there were a lot of racial elements in the making fun of him. It also did not help that most of the people of color were evicted first and stuck in Camp Comeback. And in addition to that, people like Jack demanded the entire house to not talk to anyone who was in Camp Comeback, and the optics just looked very, very, very awful. But despite that, a lot of the fans felt more bad for Nicole than any of the people of color who were also locked out during that infamous HOH session. 2024 Lala here, and I didn't mention his ethnic makeup, where he is Bangladeshi. And from what I've studied, Bangladeshis tend to be the least Caucasoid like South Asians, or one of the least, at least compared to Pakistan, India, and Sri Lanka, where they have a lot of ancestral Indian DNA, which is somewhat associated with Australian-ish, and they have a bit of East Asian admixture. And I noticed Bangladeshis are a bit less visible compared to Indians, Pakistanis, and Sri Lankans, so I was glad to see a Bangladeshi person on the season. And I do think him looking the way he did and him not being one of the quote unquote Caucasoid looking South Asians definitely played a part in his experience where it was harder for him to blend in. And the last but not least is Hannah from Big Brother 23. And she is mixed with Indian and Black. So I remember there were some people who thought that Azza did not initially include her in the cookout due to her being mixed race, though that is something that Azza denied. In the first few weeks, Hannah was on the outs of the cookout alliance, and we don't know if that's due to racial implications or because of her age, or because they didn't see the cookout as something serious at that point. I remember the producers focusing on her black side instead of her Indian side, especially since the cookout was a huge element of the season. We could have the discussion that if there were 6 Indian or 6 Asian house guests and there being 2 black house guests, one including herself, if she would have joined the Asian alliance and would have talked about that side more. So that's the dichotomy that she kind of had to face with during the season as well, and no one really talks about it. In a way, she essentially did have to choose, and because of that, she didn't get to talk about her Asian side more, though everyone in the house called her Chara, which is an Indian name, instead of Hannah. 2024 Lala here, and I don't know why in all these videos I forgot to mention their ethnic makeup, but I know Hannah, she is half black and half Indian. So, regarding the South Asian side, her ethnicity is Indian, but with her black side, I believe she is Zulu South African. The mixture of a half black person and a half South Asian person tends to be called a dougla, or at least in the Caribbean, that's what it's mainly called, but she's not from the Caribbean. And I don't know if that term is becoming more popularized outside of the Caribbean, but technically that would be her racial makeup. So the final person in this category and in this video in general is Jake from Big Brother 25, and he is a huge one. His ethnicity is a Punjabi Indian, so they're from an area that is in northwest India, and I find it interesting because Punjabis are found in Pakistan and India, but he's specifically an Indian Punjabi person. And I noticed throughout the season he specifically mentioned Punjabi, 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 Punjabi. He didn't really mention Indian. Obviously, there are many different ethnicities within India, and I'm somewhat getting personal here, but I am not a South Asian person at all, but I come from an area where there are a lot of South Asians, and the biggest ethnic group from where I am are Punjabi people, Punjabi Indians. So Jack is someone who was kind of familiar to me, not because I knew him as a person, but because I knew a lot of people like him. I found interesting that he sometimes had his turban on and sometimes had his turban off, where he showed his long hair. And I know many people who either always wore the turbans, never wore the turbans, or kind of alternated. But the difference is that the people who didn't have the turbans usually cut their hair. And I really like that scene where he was showing people how to create a turban, the meaning behind it, and the fact that they aired it on the episode was something that's very interesting. What I found interesting regarding Jag is that he is someone who heavily embraces his Punjabi Indian culture, his ethnicity, and he talked about it very openly, though he didn't weaponize it like some others weaponize their ethnicity. Or even Hassam, he tried to create like a brown thing when it was convenient, but Jag didn't really care much for that. But at the same time, you can tell that he also embraced being American and American culture in general. So I found that to be very interesting since I know a lot of people, even just immigrants or people who are of a non-white background, but weren't born here or they're either first generation to the West, they have that struggle. But Jag seems like someone who's able to balance it out very, very well, and I found that to be interesting. I did notice that Suri and Felicia made some weird comments about him. They claimed that he looked scary due to his like facial hair and his turban and stuff like that. And yeah, it definitely rubbed me the wrong way. But in general, I definitely do think that he was able to thrive more because he was in the diversity era of Big Brother. And it also feels like he is a representation of how just because you are a person of color, I'm not the biggest fan of that term, but just because you are non-white doesn't mean that you're going to get along with non-white people on average, where they're going to see your struggles or you're going to see their struggles. And I found that with Jack's dynamic with Felicia and Suri throughout the season. Obviously, he won the season, and he's the first South Asian person to win the season and the only non-black person to win in this diversity era, but he is also non-white. He kind of continued on that path that has been stabilized with the winners of this current era. And I also like that he was a monoracial Indian man, and obviously that's a different experience than someone who is mixed race. And they actively showed that in the episodes, him talking about his experience, his racial makeup, and his culture, which is something that, like I've discussed throughout this video, that they don't really do. And when they do show it, it's because they want to put people in the quote-unquote good model minority stereotype. And even that's kind of problematic, and that's something that I've definitely noticed with Big Brother, especially with the West Asian and South Asian people. So that's definitely a problematic element that I've noticed, despite them trying to do better. Alrighty, so that is it for me pertaining this video. And while there aren't many South Asians or people of West Asian descent, I like that I was able to update this with a decent amount of information and context. So I'm definitely going to do the video discussing the Black Houseguests or the people of Black descent. That one's going to be extremely long. I don't know how long it's going to be, but it'll be fun to go over it. And I'm thinking about doing a video pertaining to quote unquote spicy white people, and this tends to be Southern Europeans, since I've noticed that they tend to have a lot of stereotypes based on their white ethnic background as well. I might include some Jewish people in that, but I'm not too sure about that. So anyways, thank you all for watching the video, and I'll be back with more soon. Bye!